Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. Louisville Slugger might be the most well-known brand in baseball, but the player the brand is named after is all but forgotten. Pete Browning was one of the biggest stars of the 19th century, but also a complicated and often tragic figure, whose drinking was almost as great as his hitting. While he had Mark Fidrich-level quirks, often related to his near-deafness, his greatness on the field was undeniable. Yet he still isn't in the Hall of Fame, which Tim Newby's book, The Original Louisville Slugger, makes a strong case for. I had an awesome time talking to Tim. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Tim. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk some baseball and talk some Pete and have a good time.
But my pleasure. I always like to start off by asking, where does this idea for the book come from?
So, long story, rambling long or whatever. I had just finished my prior book, which is Leftover Statement 30 Years of Festival, which is about a band. And for part of the tour, or to promote the book, I was out on tour with the band. I would open each night, kind of talk. And we were actually down at the Ryman in Nashville. And when they were done and they were going somewhere else, and my wife and I were just going to have a little kind of road trip adventure. We drove up to Owensboro, Kentucky. We went to Romp Fest. Then we ended up in Louisville, and we were just going to do the touristy stuff, the Bourbon Trail, Slugger Museum, Muhammad Ali Museum, all that. And we went to the Slugger Museum, and I was vaguely familiar with the story of Pete Browning, but I think that's how most people are. They just kind of know the name or that he might exist out there. And on the tour, they told this story, and my wife kind of kept nudging me this guy kind of sounds super interesting. And I was kind of in my head hey, I'm ready for another book. And to kind of digress, I like stories of kind of people who maybe are overlooked or underappreciated, which is, if my first two books are more music related. But that's kind of what they are. It's the Bluegrass in Baltimore, Leftover Salmon. And this kind of seemed like he was sort of fitting, wow, here's this guy who hit 341 and had these things, but man, we don't really know a lot about him. So I remember at dinner that night, we were sitting there eating and we were just on our phones, kind of just looking up stuff oh, this is kind of funny. This is interesting. And I kind of said to her, hey, I'm going to take the rest of the summer and just see why there's nothing out there. I mean, there's a handful of articles, but there's really nothing out there on him of length or substance. And I said, I'm going to take the rest of the summer and see maybe, like we kind of said earlier, there's no story to it. It's he hit 340 and that's the end of it. But it didn't seem that way. And so I was all right, I'm going to kind of dive all into this. And I did. And I just think it's a fascinating story. Like I said, I love those stories of people who are overlooked, underappreciated, kind of forgotten. And I felt he just fell right in there. And he's still a really important baseball figure. And we don't know him. And I kind of found all these other avenues, his story, 19th century baseball, which for a lot of even hardcore baseball fans is a whole different world, So I really kind of dove in and thought that it was a lot of fun. But it kind of came off of that trip and we heard his name, and I thought, I know this guy. Let's see what it is. And it just kind of snowballed from there. And it's been great. It's been a great kind of ride to spend the last few years with Pete.
I think that you kind of nailed my experience with Pete, where it's I saw him on the leaderboard list. He's one of those names you just you say, oh, Browning. Okay, yeah. I could have told you played baseball. That's pretty much all I could have told you at that time. I've also never been to the Louisville Slugger Museum, which is something that I very much am hoping to do at some point here. Is he a bigger figure in Louisville? Do they kind of recognize him more than other places?
Yeah, I mean, it's his hometown. That's where he's from. And especially because of his ties, obviously, to the Slugger Museum, right? I mean, yeah. For those who don't know, he is the first person to have a bat turned by what becomes or makes Louisville Sluggers. It was Hillich and Bradsby. At the time, it was just the Hillich Company, where they weren't Bradsby. Bradsby wasn't involved yet. And they were just making things like butter churns and chair legs and stair rails, things that you could do on a lathe. And he had a bat made from him. And it that also snowballed from there. But yes, he is a much bigger figure in Louisville. I mean, yes, they have Muhammad Ali, but there's still a level of he's one of their biggest kind of, products out there. So he's a pretty popular figure there. He played basically his entire career in Louisville. Towards the end, he went and played for a few other teams. But he had a lot of issues where he didn't really want to leave. He was very much a homebody and he had health issues that I think led him to want to stay at home in a level of comfort. So yeah, he's a pretty popular figure there. I mean, they have a bat that, now carries his nickname. So you can say he's fairly popular.
Jumping ahead a little bit here, but I think I just saw that you are going to have your book launch at the Louisville Slugger Museum.
Yep. So September 7th, we will be doing an event there. We'll do a talk, question and answers in the museum, and then I'll be out in the lobby signing books. So if you're there on a September 7th, stop on by, chat. The publisher, University Press of Kentucky, kind of reached out to them, and they were super into it. There was a self-published book on him years ago, but as far as anything in the academic world or anything kind of that, there was nothing. So they were very much into it, and he's a name that it's still. I mean, he's his nickname's on the door kind of, but they still very much like talk about him on their tours, and he's very much a presence in the museum. So I think they were very excited to, have some of their history kind of, collected and written down. And they don't have a lot. He was basically illiterate. Like the story is he was completely illiterate, but he's not. He had some level of reading and writing and stuff like that, but he didn't write. He didn't leave letters. He didn't leave like a diary. So his history had to kind of be gathered from all these other sources. So I think for them, they didn't have a lot of that. So this is going to, be a nice thing for them to have all of that kind of history in one spot as well.
You kind of touched on this, and I am not a 19th century baseball guy. For whatever reason, it just bypassed me. One of my favorite parts of the book was he kind of plays at this very formative time in baseball history. What is it like when Pete's actually playing?
Yeah, so it really is. It's baseball figuring out how to be baseball as we know it. We have a certain understanding: 3 strikes, 4 balls, there's a pitcher's mound, all those things. And some of that stuff at the time was still being figured out. Like throughout his career, the number of balls for a walk was constantly evolving and things like that. They didn't have a pitcher's mound at first. They had a pitcher's box. And then they eventually, said, okay, well, you can't actually move within the pitcher's box. And then the pitcher's mound comes in. So we see those types of changes. Gloves were just evolving at the time. Pete's role kind of helping to say that, hey, like we really use bats a lot. Maybe we should take care of them. Whereas before it wasn't a thought. So there was, those types of ideas. So we see kind of these changes. And one of the ones I love is when they were figuring out like stats. For one season of his career, they counted walks as hits, which leads to some interesting stat lines. Pete batted 1,000 one day, but didn't register a hit, right? He had 2 walks and got hit by a pitch. So he batted 1,000 that day. They've obviously have gone back and refigured all these stats again, but I just love that we as baseball fans, because baseball, is so old and lengthy that we kind of just forget that it had evolved at some point, that they weren't doing these things that we take for granted now. And I kind of love how it's changing each year. And, oh, well, this year we're going to have this. And even hearing how guys respond to it, like, well, I think this is going to impact the batters or the hitters or this and that. And, this year we can do this and this year we can't do that. And even the idea that, like, they didn't have these, like, conveyor belt lines of pitchers coming in. One guy was pitching the whole game. And if he was getting shelled, like, the best you could do is maybe swap him with somebody in the field. But, you see some pretty amazing records, Guy Hector was like 52-20 one year, which, I love thinking that. And we're worried about a guy getting past the 5th or 6th inning now. And, this guy had 70 complete games. And I know they were throwing a little bit different, but I love seeing some of those kind of stats are like.
Did that make it difficult for you doing research?
I think you kind of had to just like put what you know about baseball to the side.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked with some like people who are way more into the number side of it than I am, who help put it in perspective, right? Like Pete only had like 46 career home runs. And somebody said to me, well, when he retired, that would have placed him, and I forget the exact number, like top 10 or whatever it was. And so those types of things you go, oh yeah, that does kind of put it in perspective. So I think getting some of that helped put it in perspective and understanding it a little better, like, oh, that's right. Yeah, he finished second one year with 9 home runs, which doesn't sound impressive. But they were playing on these monstrous fields or fields that maybe didn't have fences and with kind of equipment that we couldn't believe. I mean, they would use 1 ball all game. So, I mean, can you imagine that mess of a ball by the end of the game? Yeah. That'd be pretty tough to hit that ball. So I think kind of as you went deeper and deeper into it, it gave you a better understanding and like, okay, this is what they are dealing with. And you just got to compare it. Like I had talked to some people and this even goes to like Pete as a player, like you can't compare that to now, right? You can kind of compare it to maybe the generation before and the generation after. And there really is no generation before, right? He's kind of, even though he's 1882, what are we talking? 1876. So there's not really a generation before. So you can only compare it to after. It's not fair to go, well, how would he have compared to the 20s or the 50s or the 70s? Because it's a different game, different equipment. So I think at that time, you just got to look and go, well, how is he here? Oh, second in home runs? Must have hit the ball pretty well kind of thing,
We always talk about now how everything's so bad right now. We just had an author who wrote a book about Mike Donlin. His parents died in a train crash. Pete's dad dies in a tornado. He starts drinking at a young age. He's largely illiterate. Things were not easy for Pete. What were those early years like for Pete?
So I think, and Pete had a lot of health issues. He had mastoiditis, which caused swelling behind his ear. It caused him to be deaf. It caused pain in his eyes. And I think a lot of the myth or stories of Pete can be traced back to a lot of that. And so to kind of take your question and go in a little bit bigger thing, like I think there's this myth of Pete, of who he is. But if you really look back to who he was when he started as a child and these issues he had, and his dad dying was traumatic, but his family actually remained fairly wealthy, it seems. So that, while traumatic and I'm sure emotionally was hard, like I think some of the bigger issues were these health issues. He had trouble hearing, which really, like a lot of the oddities that we would have with him later on, you can kind of trace back to that. Some of the things he would do, some of the weird eccentric things he would do, pouring buttermilk in his eyes. In his mind, there was a reason for it. So he was born in Louisville. He developed mastoiditis early on, got it from an infection when he was 2. So pretty much his whole life, he was kind of fighting these issues. Started losing his hearing early on. I think one of the funny things about that is his name is not even Pete. His name is Louis. But he called everybody Pete, likely because he couldn't hear names when they were introduced. So it was just like a defense mechanism, like, hey, Pete. And eventually they kind of put that name on him. He drops out of school early on, but again, given the 19th century, he may have kind of peaked at the top of the education scale anyway. He was probably about 14 or 15 when he dropped out, so it may have not gone much further. But it generally seems even when he was in school, he was hiding his books under his friend's porch, and they were going off and doing other things. So he wasn't getting a lot of schooling, but I think schooling was tough. He was basically illiterate, though. It seems he could read and write on some level. There's examples of his writing and examples of him reading, stuff like that. So he's not completely illiterate, but I think all of that really leads to him having a really kind of interesting personality. He has this loud, boisterous personality, but I think it was more of a defense mechanism. I actually think he was a really kind of shy person and really insecure. So he overcame that by drinking, which kind of solved a lot of issues for him, but also by being boisterous, right? If I can't hear you talk to me, the easy response is to always talk about myself because I know what that is. If you say to me, hey, Pete, how's the weather? And I go, yeah, well, I'm the champion batter of the American Association. I can talk about that, and you're probably just going to talk about that too. And now I'm going to talk about myself. So I think all those issues of him as a child kind of really built into who he was later, this really loud, boisterous, yet insecure man who had all these odd ways of coping with it. Some of them were weird, what he did to try and take care of his health issues. And some of them were more very surface. He drank a lot, and we can find a number of reasons for why he drank. And he wasn't the only 19th century baseball player who drank.
No.
But he was one of the better ones at it. If they were, giving out titles for that, he definitely is, is a Hall of Famer in that.
He is kind of a tragic figure, and I think that there is almost the want or desire to kind of view him as this like quirky, silly guy. But it's like when you really kind of look at it, it's like he was dealing with things that people didn't really know how to deal with at the time. I mean, mastoiditis, I believe you can treat today, right?
Yeah, but at the time, I mean, we didn't have penicillin or things like that, so there was just no real common cure for infections like that. So yeah, and I think the idea of him being a tragic figure is overlooked. It's easy to look at him as this like goofy kind of caricature of a man. And when I started doing the book, that was one of the things I wanted to do, was like, there's all these myths and stories and what is true and what is not. And there's a lot of truth behind those myths. He said a lot of crazy things, but sometimes there was a reason for it. So I think he's very tragic. I think it's lost, like, how much his health issues impacted his career. They talked about his defense being awful. That's not entirely true. The numbers don't hold up that he was horrible. He may have not been great all the time, but when you read like newspaper accounts of him, they rave about his athleticism, how great he was in the field. But the problem was he started doing things he couldn't hear. Well, he stood on one leg with his knee pointed towards the runner, because if you can't hear an oncoming runner, he was worried about getting ran over, so he thought this would deter him. I mean, he was playing second short, at the beginning of his career. Not where you put your worst fielders, but he had to move because he got scared of getting run over by fielders. They put him in the outfield. They still raved about his fielding. He can't hear his teammates calling him off for a fly ball or not calling up. He's afraid of getting run into people. So he just kind of gave up on that. So I think that tragic side is that it was easy to go, oh, here's this guy, he's off on the field. Not entirely true. There's a reason for it. And then even with that, like the mastoiditis like caused like vertigo. So he like would constantly, like, he started like using his feet to stop ground balls, which sounds funny. But if you think about it, bending over to pick up a ground ball, when you got vertigo, you're probably going to fall over. So there really is a tragic side that is often lost because of those health issues.
Now that we've established him as this very serious, tragic figure, I'm going to go ahead and compare him to some goofy guys in baseball here, because he did do a bunch of goofy things. He gave me a lot of almost like a Manny Ramirez in some ways, like a Mark Fidrich, a Ricky Henderson type guy. Not playing wise, but just sort of like the personality. He didn't slide, for example, which is something that really like, just like, yeah, no, I'm not going to slide. No, like little things like that. I just like, oh, that's so refreshing. And like, oh, I love this. This is great. talking to his bats. I want to talk about his relationship with his bats because I think that is a massive part of his life and kind of one of the things that really makes him stand out compared to his peers. He does have relationships with his bats that people did not have at the time. That he takes care of them. He treats them almost like a genuine tool that he needs to succeed, as opposed to just a piece of wood. How does this relationship with the bats begin and end? How does this end up with the Louisville Slugger, essentially?
So, yeah, I think that's the thing, too, is, yes, and he was a super quirky dude despite the tragic side of it. There's a serious side to him, and there's quirky things, and some of it was quirky for quirky, some of it was quirky for answers. But the bats, like, he early on realized, well, this is kind of the tool of my trade, and at the time, like, there wasn't a lot of thought into that. You took the next one off the pile. If it broke, you maybe nailed it back together, whatever it was. And he kind of said, well, this is an important thing here. What can I swing? And he even got to the point where he was saying, I'm going to carry a heavier bat for guys who are throwing breaking balls or something, or, a lighter bat for guys who are throwing fast or whatever it was. And he started really thinking about it. When he would go to games, he would kind of check out the other pile of bats and see if there was one he liked. And he was really, really into that idea that this is an important thing, that, like, it's not just all about me. Like, there's a level here. If I have a good bat, it's going to help the ball go further or whatever it's going to be. So how it kind of ends up tying into the eventual Louisville Slugger is he broke his bat in 1884. And he got a bat turned by the Hillich Company. Now, there's questions on who did it there. Generally, the belief is it was the son, Bud Hillich. There's some difference in the stories, and there's some belief or some question on exactly the story of that. But the story, as I believe it and as it is in there, he broke a bat, he had it turned there. Now, was it the first bat they ever turned? It may have not been. They weren't a bat company at the time, but Bud played baseball. So it seems likely that they were already making some batter he was a doing bat. But I think more importantly what it was is he was the first person to have a bat made to specific specifications. I want a bat this long, this heavy. And as Bud was making, he was standing there. So it wasn't just kind of a bat that they just said, here, go play with. So I think the idea of, like, really putting thought into it becomes important. And then there's a lot of reporting throughout the rest of his career that he continued to get bats made by them. Now, they were not a bat-making company yet. And he was pretty open with sharing his bats. There's stories of when he was in Pittsburgh that he got this crate of bats, and he kind of told his teammates, hey, I got bats for everybody. I've got all these different things. So he kind of helped maybe popularize that idea to some level. It's not like, they all go, oh, yes, if it wasn't for Pete, we wouldn't have bats. But he definitely is one of the first ones that seems to really think about this idea of bats. He also kind of went to the extreme. He believed all bats had a predetermined number of hits. And when he didn't get a couple of hits in a row, he then believed it was the bat's fault, not necessarily his, and he would retire the bat away. He often named his bats after biblical figures. He kept pretty much all of his bats, but then he was fine giving them away. He would label all his bats when he retired in a basement. Some of them he made into stair rails, kind of in his basement or his mom's basement, because he lived with his mom his entire life. But he would put a little card in there that would say, like, what one of the big achievements of the bat. In 1887, I hit a 3-bagger that cleared the bases or something like that. But he also would gift the bats as well later on. He gave one to Honus Wagner when Honus Wagner was in Louisville, which, is probably where Honus Wagner came to understand the power of Hillich and Bradsby and Louisville Sluggers, as he would then eventually become the first person to put his name on there. So he really is the first person to put a lot of thought into this. And, I think that's a great story too. Pete's this kind of wise guy at this point, or as wise as Pete can be after his career. And he would kind of befriended all the players on the Louisville team. And Honus came over and, looked at all these bats and said, I really like that one. And Pete was like, well, why don't you take that one and go ahead and use that one there. So he had this deep connection with bats, but he also wasn't afraid to give them out and kind of spread the magic, maybe, so to speak, and give people these bats. But he did a lot of things. He talked to them and, believed that they held magical properties. And, when he went up, he had superstitions. When he approached the plate that he had to do, he had to push his hair out of his eyes, because it was, getting in the way of his lamps and all these different types of things like that. So it all goes, but the bat was like his tool, his special instrument that he had.
Did you have an opportunity to see or hold one of Pete's bats at any point here?
When you go to the Slugger Museum, they actually have one out, so you can see, and it's massive, right? I mean, compared to modern standards, it's 46 ounces. It's 37 inches long, so I mean it's huge. What are modern bats? 32, 33 ounces, right?
I can tell you right now. So working for the Yankees, I get to hold an Aaron Judge bat on a pretty regular occasion, and he's obviously a big guy. Yeah. He swings a 35-inch, 33-ounce bat. So Pete's bat is an inch longer, and then the thing I always tell people, the red donut that you put on the bat for like a bat weight, that is 15 ounces. So Pete's bat is an inch longer than Judge's with the donut on.
That's I never put that. That's a great wow. It really puts it in perspective for people. And
Yeah.
it didn't taper a whole lot. So you had to have big hands. I mean, that thing, it didn't taper a whole lot from the top to the bottom. That makes it even harder.
There's a Babe Ruth bat that people can hold too, and he's swaying usually like a 36, 45 ish. I mean, but he's with Ruth, it could be up to like 50. Supposedly, we don't have any of those, like in the 40s or 50s or so. Again, a big bat, and when I hold those bats, it's the handle. It's always the handle, and they're very, very top heavy. Yeah. And those are the things I noticed compared to today's bats. It's like they're just like Judge's bat is a big bat, but it's just so well balanced. How tall was Brown? Browning was like 5'9", 5'10", something like that.
6 foot 6'1", 180.
Okay,
a little bigger than average at the time. A little taller than average, a little bigger than average at the time. But again, I mean, we're thinking that's a pretty average size these days. I mean, what does Eric Judge weigh? How tall is he now? You know what I mean? That's
6'7", 282. Like it's a little different. Yeah.
And modern stuff like that. I mean, here's he wasn't hitting the gym after games. You know what I mean? Like the only thing he might have been lifting might have been like a 12-ounce spear or like a weight. He definitely wasn't getting his weightlifting in. He wasn't workout.
Yeah. So the Louisville Slugger is then named after Pete because that is Pete's nickname, correct?
Yeah. So he had a lot of nicknames. That was used in an article towards the end of his career. So that's not like something he had the whole time, but it makes sense. He had established himself. So there was an article that called him the Louisville Slugger. He had a lot of nicknames. Some of them were not very positive. Most of them weren't, but he was fine with it. I don't think Pete had a problem with any publicity. He was called the Gladiator. He was called Old Pete, the Old War Horse, Old Red Eye, Prince of Bourbon, Pietro Red Light, Distillery Browning, Brown Jug Browning. So a lot of them had to do with drinking or late nights. I don't think he really minded that a whole lot. Again, I don't think Pete thought that any publicity or any kind of press was bad press. He was happy when people were talking about him.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to jump ahead a little bit here to another one of my favorite parts of the book, 1889. What happens in this season with Pete?
They are the worst team in baseball, and they're a bit of a talking point right now, right?
I mean, I'm in Chicago. I'm going to the White Sox game tonight, but it is not that level of disaster. It seems like.
So they lost 26 in a row, and that might have been one of the better things they did all season. They had a player strike that year. Literally, players refused to play. Their manager was fining them so that he could make payroll. So he would find anything to fine them on. They muffed a ground ball. He would fine them $25 so that he could then try and pay them. They weren't getting paid. They had to do things when they were on the road. Like they were asking the other team if they could do their laundry because they couldn't afford to pay for laundry and stuff like that. They were just a horrendous team. They had somebody bought them in 1888, and how much he may have known about baseball is very questionable. And that even wasn't the problem. There was just a number of issues that were going on. He was a pretty bad owner on some level. Financially, it didn't seem he was very responsible there. The players didn't like playing for them. And then as they just got worse and worse and worse, it just kind of snowballed from there. And the interesting thing is the following season, they win the World Series. Which is they go from worst to first. Now, again, 1890, there's 3 leagues, so there's a whole another story there. But 1889, when they were horrendous, when you start looking at some of their stats, what they did, the number of losing streaks they had. I mean, they lost 26 in a row. They had a losing streak of 13. It was pretty bad. They are definitely one of the worst all times in baseball, which is nice that we can be talking about them again now as we're, witnessing some pretty horrendous baseball.
How does Pete manage that season? I mean, how does he hold up through this miserable season there?
I don't think well. It's one of the first seasons at that time that he didn't finish in the top 3 in batting. And it makes for an interesting point in his career because people often look at that and then think anything he does after that was a comeback. And I think that season needs to be looked at more as of an anomaly because he wins a batting title the next season in the Players League. And I think people kind of look at it as Pete was done at this point and look at this comeback. And I think it was more, the team was just so bad. He was still drinking a lot. I think this might have been maybe the peak of his drinking. In 1890, even though the belief is that he always drank, he actually really tries to stop drinking. How much he stopped in 1890, there's some question there. It seems he was fairly sober from 1890 on. Now the question is, he would make comments, I haven't blown one off since last year. But then there's a few stories where he still seems to be drinking. But I think he was drinking a lot, 1888, 1890, drinking heavily. So I think that was a problem. He was fined a lot for things he did. in spite one time, like he threw his bat in the water just like because he was so pissed off at the owner, and the owner fined him, and so he threw another one in the water because he was like, well, that was my bat, I can do what I want, you're going to fine me for throwing my bat away. So things like that. He was part of the players' strikes when they refused to show up. The team eventually gets sold mid-year, and a lot of the fines got returned to the players. Not all of them. Pete was still the most heavily fined player that season, so he didn't respond very well at all. And his time kind of comes to an end in Louisville, even though the team, it seems, wanted him back. I think the relationship was really fractured there, and he just felt, some of these things, they owed me money for this and that, and he was always very concerned with money. His family was very wealthy, it appears, and never a problem. He seems to have been very good with his money, but it always seems money was an important thing to him. And he just felt that they had mistreated him, and that really led to him wanting to leave and get out of Louisville. And even though he wanted to be at home as much as possible, it kind of led to the end of his time in Louisville, even though he comes back, for a little bit more after that.
Yeah. I mean, he does play for a few more years of varying levels of success. He has a couple good years in there for sure. And then, by within 4 years, 1894, I believe he's done.
Yep.
What does Pete do after baseball?
I think he really struggles. I think he didn't have a lot besides baseball. I mean, as we said, he was limited education, basically illiterate, and baseball was kind of all he knew, and that was who he was. He actually tried to be an umpire, and interestingly enough, he was always throughout his career recognized for his honesty on the field. But I think that he never was going to get a chance because of who he was, because he was Pete. I think if it was a different day and age, we could see him, being a color guy for baseball and being hysterical and being great.
Oh,
but he was never going to go into any kind of like other level of baseball, what he had. I just didn't think he had it. He did play some after he retired in 1894. Or, I mean, I guess retire is not really the word. He just didn't have any other opportunities. He did play in some of the different kind of leagues around the Southern League and stuff like that. He played a little bit more baseball. He approached some teams up being kind of, for lack of a better word, a designated hitter, that wasn't a thing at the time. But he said, I would like to be like your substitute hitter and stuff. So he approached him about some of that. But he didn't have a lot. Money doesn't seem to have been an issue for him throughout the rest of his life. He did work, ironically, even though he wasn't drinking. He owned a couple of saloons. He was a cigar salesman. He had run for political office a couple times with no success, and he ends up dying in 1905. His health really started deteriorating towards the end of his career, and it just kind of kept getting worse and kind of worse throughout there. And I just think he was actually committed to an insane asylum. And again, I think that was less of him being insane and more of a lack of understanding of some of the health issues, right? We just didn't have the understanding of what it was. So I don't think he had a very happy time that the last maybe 10 years of his life. He never married, never had kids, lived at home with his mom and his sister his whole life. So I just think he never really found anything after baseball. He still would always talk as much as he could. So I think he could just never let it go. He was still known, if he was out somewhere to talk about himself and do whatever. And I just think he just couldn't handle being kind of forgotten and didn't know what to do without baseball. He had nothing else to turn to, nothing else to do.
That was kind of my next question was, how was he thought of at the end of his life? Is he still remembered as this great player, or is he already beginning to kind of be passed by at that point?
Interesting. So I think I'd said to you before, I talked to somebody who said, like, when you look at these players, you want to see how the next generation still talks about them. And in articles at the time, he was still talked about as like one of the best players from that time. And I think that's the interesting thing. And I know you mentioned the Hall of Fame before, and I think that's just it. That next generation, he's still remembered. But then by the time we start getting to the Hall of Fame, he is now a little bit even further gone, and people don't know about him. It was easy, that next generation. I mean, there's a number of other reasons that we can get into, but I think he still was recognized for that. That's also when Hillich and Bradsby starts really promoting Louisville Sluggers after his death. But so they start talking about him a little bit. So there is a little bit in ads and stuff that they would do to kind of promote him. But I do think eventually, I mean, you figure, we didn't have YouTube. We weren't going and watching his highlights and stuff like that. We weren't pulling up newspaper.org where we can go look at these old stories and stuff. So I think that he does get forgotten, because who do you talk about? You talk about who you've seen play. Well, as we get further and further away, less and less people have seen him play. And it just becomes this, like all those players, shadowy figure that we sort of remember out in the ether, but I don't really remember what it was like. He hit the ball far, maybe, and I think that happens to a lot of players as we get further and further away,
Well, and it's funny. I was telling my wife about Pete Browning, and she's like, "Is there someone like that today who's just going to be kind of forgotten?" And it's like, well, it's not really. I mean, like the first guy that came to mind was like a Zach Greinke, who was like had this like great career, but just a quiet guy. He's going to disappear. Like he already has disappeared. You're just not going to hear any more from Zach Greinke. But we'll always be able to pull up Zach Greinke highlights and look at his baseball cards, and like he's never gonna be erased in the same level as someone like Pete. And I wonder if that really has a lot to do with his Hall of Fame case, which frankly, you look at the stats, I think he has a fantastic case, and which is still amazing today. Like now knowing so much more about baseball stats and being able to analyze things that we didn't actually see, that there hasn't been more of a push for him to get to the Hall of Fame. Do you feel like there's any change in that? I mean, a book like this will only help, I think.
I do. I think the big thing is, there was no internet, there was no baseballreference.com, right? So by the time the Hall of Fame was rolling around, I mean, he had been dead for, 30 years. He played most of his career in the American Association. So I think there was just already a natural bias towards that at the time. Baseball scholarship wasn't what it was. We weren't thinking about it and analyzing and looking at it. So I do think that led to him being forgotten. I think that a lot of those players in that league were overlooked and passed over. Though, somebody above my pay grade can tell you exactly. I don't believe there's a whole lot of difference when players move from league to league. They generally seem to finish in the same relative position, hitting, pitching, whatever it was. So it doesn't seem that the talent level was vastly different. In 1891, Pete is in the National League for the first time. He finishes third in batting, and he started off horrendous that year. He arguably, if he would have stayed with Cincinnati or would have been with Cincinnati all year, he could have won a batting title, which would have been 4 batting titles in 3 leagues, which nobody could ever do, right?
No.
I think that not we, but I think people who at the time were looking at the Hall of Fame just disregarded the American Association, and it was forgotten too. I mean, there wasn't, again, all this, the internet and things to pull up stats. It took a while to compile and get all that back again. So I think that led to that. And I've talked to some people who are like, well, don't we have enough players from the 19th century in the Hall of Fame? Which, I mean, shouldn't we have all the correct players from whatever era? I mean, and I know that we can't put everybody in, but I don't really like that argument. Like, that seems like, well, it's a long time ago. It takes a lot of work to do that, So I think any attention to him, and I think he's not the only 19th century player that deserves a look, right? There's a lot of players that deserve a look, and I think they all should be worthy of that, especially now that we have this much more improved scholarship, baseball scholarship and stats, and can really look and compare things, and numbers help. Sometimes we need to go back to the source and see what people thought at the time, and I think that's kind of, we had said before we started, like, I'm not always a numbers guy. I think that's an important way to look at it. But what did people at the time say? And people at the time and the people after were like, well, Pete's great. You know what I mean? He's one of the legendary hitters and greatest hitters. So I think we also need to remember how he was viewed then at the time and how he was viewed by those people for all players. I mean, it's easy 20 years after the fact to be like, oh, like, was Dale Murphy that good? Which he was, because I'm a huge Dale Murphy fan. But, it's easy as you get further and further away to then just look at the numbers and kind of forget what he looked like on the field, those types of things and stuff. And so I think that's what we've done with Pete a little bit, is we just go, well, the numbers are borderline Hall of Fame and Hall of Fame, but, well, okay, that's fine. It's easy, and kind of forget what he was regarded as and how he was and how legendary he was and all the other things he did and stuff.
Well, and, to that point too, I gotta say the cover photo, unbelievable. That is a man you want in the Hall of Fame. Like that man, it's like, that is the ideal 19th century baseball man. Incredible cover. Where was that photo from? How did that, did you find that, or where was that from?
So there was the old Judge baseball cards from that era. So it's there. I mean, that's one thing was interesting and tough about this is, now if you're doing something, there's so much out there, pictures and stuff like that. The number of pictures of him is very limited. You know what I mean? There's the ones you see in the book, and that's pretty much all that exists in him. There's, some sketches in newspapers you had, but they're often, the sketches in newspapers were just sketches of some of those pictures. But that was taken from a baseball card. And then obviously they've been colorized. There was no color or no video or any of that kind of stuff then. So it is interesting to see kind of how imposing he was and the big mustache. And you're like, oh yeah, this is 19th century baseball. This is a guy that like was definitely out last night, like, hitting the tonsil varnish and waking up this morning at 100% and went out. And as he would say, like, stung a couple 3-baggers or whatever and stuff. So, and then didn't slide in the third because he doesn't want to increase his laundry bill.
That was Tim Newby. His book, The Original Louisville Slugger, The Life and Times of Forgotten Baseball Legend Pete Browning, is out September 17th. To close us out, we have Hugh Findlay reading his poem from our latest issue.
God at the Ballpark by Hugh Findlay. I saw God at the ballpark, and as usual, he caught every foul ball. He sang the national anthem and also Take Me Out to the Ball Game for the 7th inning stretch. After 6 beers, I saw him in the men's room showing off by hitting the urinal from 10 feet away. But when I asked for his autograph, he said it was a major inconvenience and he was out of my league anyway. That's when both benches emptied and his team got the holy crap beaten out of them for beating the Bat Boy. Later that evening, I ate an entire apple pie all by myself, and I felt a whole lot better.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,